Okay, this week there's a lot of new things that we're going to introduce tonight, and some old things we're going to kind of go over again. But I think it's a pretty good lesson because it's got some new ideas that probably most of us don't think about. But this is where God is starting to explain why He does what He does and why things are the way they are, is for redemption. We always have to keep in mind that this is a redemption story, and we have to be redeemed. So He is going to talk about His idea of redemption, and it might surprise you of why the Egyptian firstborn had to die and all of these things that he did. It wasn't for retribution, it was to redeem Israel. So he's going to talk about that in just a minute. We'll go over it. And he's got some other things that maybe you don't think about, but it's all being built here. If you're a Hebrew, you will learn this kind of stuff, and most Christians don't go there. So it's kind of interesting. Last week we saw Moses move the Israelites out of Egypt and into Sukkot before going into the wilderness. Now Sukkot is a temporary building. It's like a tent or a shack. So I thought it was interesting that they went to a town called Sukkot. So it was temporary before they go into the wilderness. God marked this occasion by instituting Passover as an ordinance forever. And on my copy I put forever, underlined. This has been one of the things that's always bothered me because there's several, we went through the Leviticus 23 feasts and festivals, and all of them it says you will keep these forever. You will keep these perpetually. And yet we don't keep any of them. And they said, well, that's for the Jews. Well, as I explained before, we have to join the Jews. Chapter 13, we'll see a few more rules instituted. What God is doing is setting up symbolic ordinances for the Jews to observe every year to remind them of what He did for them, and it will picture a day coming in the future to be looking for. Each one of these rules will draw a picture of some very important encounters with the Lord in the future. Now last week we saw that He had already ordered Passover to be something we keep every year, but He said do it when you get to Canaan, so they won't have to be doing it in the wilderness. Now they will do it one time in the wilderness, but He didn't want it. It was like, wait until you get to the promised land and then keep it. Well, the original Passover was just a little different than what He wants you to observe. So He was giving the new rules for Passover and how it should be observed and when they get to Canaan. Always keep in mind that Exodus is a picture of the last days. And I underlined, always keep that in mind, because so many times, well, what is Exodus? Well, that's when the Jews were released from slavery. What does it have to do with me? Well, it has to do exactly with the last days. There's going to be plagues, there's going to be wars, and there's going to be attacks, and there's going to be everything that we see here is going to be pictured in Exodus, okay? We will see Pharaoh take up arms against God's people, knowing that God is helping them. Next week, we're going to see that Pharaoh's troops are going to say God is with the Israelites, and they're supposed to go attack them. And we're going to see the Shekinah glory of God is going to be between Egypt and Israel, holding them off, and the soldiers are saying, we need to turn back. This is ridiculous. What does that say? They're going to know in the last days that they're fighting God, and they're going to say, let's go.
Yeah.
That's how stupid it's going to be.
Yeah.
They're going to go up against God and get wiped out. Let's see. This same insanity will mark the last days with the Antichrist coming against Israel, knowing God is on their side. It is also a picture of redemption by God of His people. Okay, verse 1, 13. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, consecrate to me all the firstborn, whatever opens the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and beast, it is mine. He is saying that all of your firstborn are mine. He's claiming them. If you're going to be His disciple, or He's going to be your God, then you're going to have to give all of your firstborn. And that includes your animals, as well as your children. Okay? God got straight to the point in the second verse here. The principle is huge with God and His people. the firstborn, the first fruit, the first of everything is always belongs to God. That's why when we talk about tithing, you can say, well, I got paid today, but I need to see how I'm going to be at the end of the month. That's not how you tithe. If you expect to get blessed from tithing, that should be the first check that you write. Okay? And so many people will just take from the stash and say, well, this ought to do it. That's not the way you do it. Whatever it is, you give willingly the first. So it's the first of your children, the first of everything that comes into your home, the first. In fact, the Pharisees were so strict, they would give the first of their salt and pepper and cumin and whatever herbs they had. And of course, that's not what Jesus was talking about, but they understood the first, you know. So that's the point of learning about the first of everything, the firstborn. And you kind of look at it and say, well, what does that really mean? And he took the firstborn of Egypt to pay the ransom for Israel so they could be redeemed. We don't ever think about that. Whenever something is redeemed, bloodshed has to come. We don't understand that, but we think that somehow I got a freebie. I just tell Jesus that I love him and I make him my Savior. Well, we have been redeemed by his blood. Okay? So there is a payment for every time there's a redemption. Okay? God had just taken the firstborn of Egypt, both man and beast. The story of Exodus is a story of redemption, and now God is telling them how they are to redeem their animals and their children. God is not making a suggestion here, but commands them to redeem their firstborn. Verse 3, and Moses said to the people, remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for by the strength of the hand of the Lord brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten. So Passover happened in Egypt, and then the next day they left, and that's unleavened bread. So he is declaring a feast there. On this day you're going out in the month of Abib. Now, this is confusing, and remember what I talk about with the calendar business. Abib is just another name for Nisan. Nisan is what most of them would use, but in this case they used Abib, but that's just another name for it. It's still the fourth month. But see, God has changed the fourth month to the first month. So if you're in the religious calendar, Passover starts on the first month. It would be the first month, the 14th day. But in a normal situation, it's usually the fourth month, the 14th day is Passover, the 15th starts unleavened bread. So just putting Abib in here, I didn't want to get y'all upset, but Nisan is actually what he's saying. And it shall be when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall keep the service of this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and no leavened bread shall be seen among you, nor shall leaven be seen among you in all of your quarters. Now, they knew that the leaven was what bread rises on. But actually what he's saying is sin. This is a holy time. And he's marking it saying, I don't want any sin during this time. But they were supposed to go through the ritualistic looking for the leaven and tossing it out and burning it in the fire and going through all the unleavened bread ceremonies. But really what he is saying is during this time, I want you to think about what I did for you, and I want you to be repentant, and I don't want any sin to be in your house. So for like 7 or 8 days there was no leaven anywhere in any Israeli home. And you shall tell your son that day, saying, this is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came up from Egypt. So he is saying, pass this on to your children. What do we not do? We don't tell our kids anything. That's why it's lost. That's why when you stop celebrating these things, the children aren't asking, why are you doing this? And then we explain what God has done for us. Moses tells Israel that they will memorialize Passover and unleavened bread every year after they enter into the promised land. Verse 4 speaks of the month of Abib, but that is just another name for Nisan. Israel was still in Egypt when Passover happened, but left Egypt on the first day of unleavened bread. God was modifying the instructions he had already given about Passover, but the changes would take effect when they entered Canaan. Notice also he named the tribes that would lose their land to Israel, and they were all descendants of Ham, and more specifically Canaan, Ham's son. Canaan was the one that cursed by Noah. They had many giants and would eventually be wiped out. So he named the tribes that are going to have to be wiped out because they'll never give up their land willingly. So these were all cursed by God, by Noah, when they got off the ark. Ham was the one that did the sin, whatever it was, but Canaan got the curse. And so the people of Canaan went to Canaan land and settled there, and that's going to be the promised land that God's going to take from them. Okay? What is that called? Redemption. Somebody's got to die. These feast days will again be codified in Leviticus 23. But I wanted to make the point that Israel already knew these days, and we're observing them long before Leviticus. In the act of redemption, God will offer his firstborn to redeem his people, and the unleavened bread is the offering of the flesh of Jesus for his people. Jesus said, "This is my body which was given for you." His body was the unleavened bread of communion. During this time there will be no leaven found in Israel for the whole 7 days. When your son asks you what you're doing, they will teach them this is about coming out of Egypt in bondage. So he is telling you that this is, remember Abraham tried to give his son. Well, God substituted a lamb for him. So he was painting a picture of the substitutionary redemption of God's son. So that all of these pictures are being painted here so that a Jew is going to know that there's going to be a lamb from God coming. And they can look for a lamb with horns if they wanted to. But when John the Baptist said, "Here comes the Lamb of God," he was introducing him. He was making the way straight for him to let everyone that heard his voice know this is the Lamb of God. And a Jew knows that every lamb is meant to sacrifice. Every lamb is subject to sacrifice. So they couldn't miss the picture, you know. Verse 19. "And it shall be a sign to you on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law may be in your mouth, for with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this ordinance in its season from year to year." Now what is he talking about here? Do we know what a phylactery is? You ever heard of a phylactery? The Hebrew name is tefillin. And they have a little box here. And they have a strap on it that straps it onto their head. They have an arm strap that goes around their arm, and it's got a box on it. And in these boxes, they get little scrolls of paper and write these verses down. Roll it up like a scroll and put it in the box, and they wear it during this 7-day period. And they've got it memorized, of course. But he says that this will be a sign to you on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, so the Lord may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. Well, they interpreted that as saying, well, I need to take these verses that he's going to give me here in a minute, and I'm going to roll them up and put them in here, and I'm going to memorize them. They're going to be on my mind all the time, and they're going to identify me as God's people. These are little boxes tied with leather straps to their heads, between their eyes, and around their arms. They had little scrolls inserted in them that contained the verses in Exodus 13, 1 through 16, Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, and Deuteronomy 11, 13 through 21. They would memorize these verses and contemplate them over the holidays. All this was required to be taught to the children. So they even had these specific verses and that's the ones that they wore, and they were to remember this time when God brought them out of Egypt. And they're supposed to teach it to their children. So when you go to these verses, the last verse in there is going to say, do this in memorial for me. Put it between your eyes and on your arm. Every one of them says that. So this is what they did. How silly is that? You have this little box on your head and everything. But they did it because they loved God. And He commanded them to do it. And they did it. Okay. Is there going to be a counterfeiter coming that will require a sign to be on our foreheads and hands?
Yes.
Okay? The beast will require this to show allegiance to him when the time comes. There will be no doubt you are swearing fealty to the beast and abandoning God when this comes about. So many people, they're so obsessed with the mark of the beast. What is it going to be? How is it going to be? It's going to be his name, more than likely. If someone asks you to take a tattoo on your forehead and it's going to be Joe Blow, I wouldn't do it. You know? But everyone thinks that they're going to be tricked into this. No. You're going to know exactly what you're doing when this happens. So we need to probably stop worrying so much about what it is and worry about who it is. Because we're going to know if you don't have this tattoo, you can't do business. Okay, he says put a chip in. Well, what's on the chip? My name. Yeah. Nope, not going to do that. Yeah. Just like Pharaoh and his people will shortly do, you will be swearing to go against God's people and God. This is why I keep raising the need to bless Israel and make no excuse to turn against them. You will eventually be coming against God Himself. I know that there's going to be some Jews that are going to mess up. They're going to say some hurtful things. They're just like everybody else. It would be just like dealing with the Chinese or Russians or whoever. They're going to mess up. But we should never turn against Israel, the country, because those are God's people, and He will protect them, and you're going to be against God. This is the sign of the Antichrist, is to be anti-Semitic. If you come up and say that all Jews are this and all Jews are that, that's a bad sign. You have the spirit of Antichrist in you. Yeah. And Jesus said the spirit is already here when He was walking the earth because they hated the Jews. And it shall be when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites as He swore to you and your fathers and gives it to you, that you shall set apart to the Lord all that open the womb, that is every firstborn that comes from an animal which you have, the males shall be the Lord. So now we're going back to the firstborn again. He's going to go back and add more to it to let you know more about what He's talking about. But every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, and if you will not redeem it, then you shall break its neck. And all the firstborn of man amongst your sons you shall redeem. And underline that. So now he's talking about if you have a donkey, you don't kill the firstborn, you have to kill a lamb. Well, a lamb is a clean religious animal. Ceremonial animal, I should say. Doves are clean ceremonially. There are unclean animals and there are clean animals. So if you're a Jew, you need to know these things because you wouldn't want to sacrifice an unclean animal to God.
Yeah. Would it have anything to do with donkeys can't reproduce?
Huh?
Would it have anything to do with the fact that donkeys can't reproduce?
No, that's mules. Yeah. Donkeys can reproduce. Yeah. Mules can't reproduce. But the whole idea is that there are unclean pigs or unclean animals. To sacrifice a pig in the temple was the biggest abomination ever. Abomination of desolation, it was called. So, what he is saying, every son is unclean. It has to be redeemed with a lamb. So when you have a firstborn son, you have to go kill a lamb. Yeah. He doesn't want you to kill your son, but it's dirty and it has to be redeemed. Yes. So a donkey is the same thing. So if you want to keep the donkey, you have to kill a lamb. Now, you may want to keep the lamb, and yet you don't need any more donkeys. Well, then you kill the donkey, break its neck. That's what it says. Yeah. So a lot of people don't understand what's going on there. But what he is saying, that every firstborn has to be redeemed. And if it's unclean, it has to be redeemed with a lamb. So if you are unclean, you have to be redeemed with a lamb. God sent a lamb to redeem us.
Thank you, Lord.
Verse 14, so it shall be when your son asks you in times to come, saying, what is this? Then you shall say to him, by the strength of the hand of the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of this house of bondage. And it came to pass, when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, that the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all males that open the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. It shall be as a sign on your hand and as the frontlets between your eyes, for by the strength of the hand of the Lord brought us out of Egypt. So there again, those are verses that go in the little box. But what he is saying, notice how he put that in there, that I was redeemed by the firstborn dead of Egypt. So he is telling you why I killed all the firstborn in Egypt. Remember, we thought that was just to get them to let them go. Well, he was making payment for them by taking, I call it ransoming and redeeming. The ransom price paid was the firstborn of Egypt. And the redeemed were the firstborn of Israel. That's the way it worked. Well, we're back to the firstborn again with more rules. All of this won't start until they get into Canaan, but God is preparing them for what is coming. Picture what God is saying must happen in a Jewish household. Every firstborn male sheep had to be killed. All the rest belonged to the man of the house, but the firstborn was always God's. If a donkey or an ass was born, you wouldn't kill the donkey, but kill a lamb instead. The donkey had to be redeemed to keep it. If you didn't redeem it with a sheep, then you should break its neck. Now the man's firstborn son had to be redeemed with a lamb. A child watching this might ask Dad, I thought we were in the sheep business, and you kill lambs all the time. Dad would explain to them that they were brought out of Egypt, out of the firstborn of Egypt were taken from the lives of Israel. So he would have to explain to them that this is how it's done. This is why it's done. So I can just imagine a kid saying, every time a lamb's born, you kill it.
Yeah.
And we're in the sheep business. You know, this is not good policy. But he would have to explain to them because God redeemed them with the firstborn. Why would a man kill a lamb for a donkey? A lamb was ritually clean animal, but a donkey was not. Sacrificing a donkey would have been an abomination to God. So why was a lamb the required sacrifice for the firstborn sons? Humans are unclean to God and require a clean animal to redeem them. All humans are treasured by God, and killing the firstborn son would have been an abomination. Another reason God hates abortions. Spiritually speaking, what does an ass represent? Job 11:12. For an empty-headed man will be wise when a wild donkey's colt is born a man. So he is saying that if you're a carnal man, you're an ass. So any carnal man has to be redeemed to be anything other than just unclean. That's basically what he's saying. Now if you remember back in our Genesis study, it said that Ishmael was born a wild ass. Remember we had a little chuckle over that verse. But that's what, if you look through here, a donkey's colt, anywhere it's written, it means that it's carnal. It needs to be redeemed. There were several other verses that referred to carnal man as a wild ass. Ishmael was called that in Genesis 16:12, if you want to go back and read it. We need to understand that God will ransom Egypt for Israel's redemption. God will ransom Canaan for Israel. Remember, he's already said, I'm going to give you the land of Canaan. So all these deaths are pre-planned. Later, in a sense, God ransomed Israel for the sake of the Gentiles. Now, I want y'all to think about this. The price that Israel has paid so that we could be grafted in.
Yeah.
They are hated all over the world. And they have died by the millions. Okay? God has given Israel the burden of keeping the Word of God through the ages, and all the covenants were made with them. But the price for this would be very high, as the persecuted people of God in every time period and place on the planet. Israel has paid and is still paying a very heavy price so that we could be joined into the family of God. No one has the right to be proud or haughty. For some reason, Christians think that they got it made and the Jews have got it all wrong. Okay? It's heavy load to be God's people in the world. But now Gentiles have the burden of spreading the gospel across the world. I wanted to add that in there. We think that, well, we've been redeemed by the death of Israelites. But we have to earn our keep. We're supposed to be doing what God wants us to do. And if we're not spreading the gospel, we're not doing what God's supposed to do, or what we're supposed to do for God. There are two types of redemption: the substitutionary redemption and the kinsman redeemer. The picture of substitutionary redemption was drawn with Abraham to sacrifice his son, Isaac, and God provided a substitutionary ram in a bush. Remember the burning bush in front of Moses? I thought it was kind of neat that the ram was caught in the bush, and then Moses came to a burning bush. So the bush provided the lamb to Abraham, and he came to Moses. So I kind of put that together. God provided his own lamb for Abraham's son. Now here, could be put to memory if you wanted to memorize it. This is the whole thing in a nutshell. Egypt was set apart for death, and a ransom for Israel. So they paid the ransom. Israel was set apart for life and a sacrifice for God, to service to God. So the Jews' job is service to God. Now you can go to Iran, or you can go to China, or wherever. They're going to have religious people and all that. But the true servants of God was Israel. So they were set aside for service to God. The second type of redemption is the kinsman redeemer. This always involved a brother marrying his dead brother's wife to save her from death with no inheritance. In the Jewish culture, and most cultures actually, when a woman lost her husband, a woman was not allowed to own anything, no land, no animals, no nothing. She was starved to death. That could be her house and her land and her animals that she has lived with all these years with her husband, but now that he's gone, she can't own them. Some other brother or some other cousin or something would come and take them. Whoever was in the next line of inheritance. But she had no say-so. So, her husband's brother was asked, do you want this woman? And he could either have pity or mercy on her or not. And so they would make a contract, and he would marry her so that she wouldn't starve to death, out of respect for her brother.
I think he was the only one that could marry her, wasn't he?
Well, no, another person could, but the kinsman redeemer had first choice.
Yeah.
They said it had to be the brother, and then if he couldn't, then it'd be the next brother.
Right. But women were beggars. They basically were left, if maybe her husband's brother was poor, couldn't support anymore in the house, and maybe she was so old she couldn't earn her keep, or whatever. So we don't really know what the pecking order was, but there were some that were left out. They were widows that went to the one with the two mites, had to go to the temple and all this kind of stuff. But if you could find a relative that would take you, then you would marry into that family, and maybe you'd be grandma and keep the kids and cook and clean and whatever, and he would get use out of you. Okay. A donkey could possibly be worth less than the lamb used to redeem it. Like maybe it's defective, sickly, or you just need the lamb more than the donkey. You still weren't allowed to just keep it, so you broke its neck. Sons, however, were required to be redeemed always. This taught the Jews that human life was always to be redeemed, and it would always cost a price. Egypt paid the price for Israel's people to be redeemed. If God's people are to be saved, it will cost a high price for God, and that it would be through substitutionary death of a male, and it must be the firstborn. Verse 15 tells us that God explained all this plainly to Israel, And verse 16 again tells them to remember this principle and teach it to their children. It was possible to redeem your firstborn by a payment to the temple in silver. So if you wanted to, you could go slip a few silver coins to the priest and he would sacrifice his lamb. But it still had to be a lamb and a sacrificed lamb, but you could pay a priest to do it for you. Spiritually speaking, silver represents blood. When we get to the tabernacle, we will learn the whole temple tabernacle set on hardware made of silver. We're going to see that the whole thing was based on silver hardware that touched the ground. Verse 17, then it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near, for God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. Now underline orderly ranks because there's a word there, a Jewish word. But the whole idea here is you would think that when you want to get out of there and you've got Pharaoh that may be coming after you, why wouldn't you go straight shot to the promised land? Well, the straight shot to the promised land was all across Egyptian territory where they had troops and outposts. And then you're going to hit the Philistines' land, who don't want to see 3 or 4 million people marching across the land. So it's going to be war, 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 and more war. So God said, I don't want them to be discouraged right off the bat, so I'm going to lead them in another way. He was going to go down below and then come up. Now the orderly ranks means 5. The main thing I wanted you to see is armed men, because some versions say they were armed and some say they just went in columns of 5. But if you had 5 men abreast, 3 million strong, you're looking at 60 miles of people. So I believe they just kind of went like they wanted to go, but they were all armed. They had taken weapons when they left. But they didn't want them fighting all the time, because they might get discouraged and say, well, I got out of bondage out of Egypt, and we're just all going to die out here trying to go somewhere else. Why don't we just go back to Egypt? You know, what happens to a person that just gets saved? They'll think it was easier just to go back into their bondage again. So they'll slide back into alcoholism or whatever it is. Okay, God could have led them the straightest route to Canaan through the Philistines' highway, but the route was covered with Egyptian soldiers and outposts, and the Philistines would not be happy with 3 million people coming their way. God didn't want them in a war in the first week out of bondage, or they might just decide to go back to Egypt. So he led them south towards the Red Sea. There is a great controversy about the term orderly ranks in verse 18. Some believe they were in ranks of 5 across because it's a military term. But 3 million people would be 60 miles from front to back. Most of them think that God was making the point that they were armed with swords like an army. Verse 19. And Moses also took the bones of Joseph with him, who had made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones away from here with you. If y'all remember back in Genesis, when Joseph was dying, he told everybody to make sure that you take me back with you, because he knew that the 400 years was going to be over, and he wanted to go with them. He didn't want to stay. And they took their journey from Succoth and camped in Etham in the edge of the wilderness. If we remember, Joseph knew Israel would be held at least 400 years, but eventually they would be led by God to the promised land. And he made them swear to take his mummified corpse with them. In Joshua 24, they indeed buried Joseph at Shechem. So if you ever get to Joshua, it says that they put him in Shechem with his fathers. That'll be Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the rest of them. Okay. Verse 20 speaks of them moving from Succoth to Etham at the edge of the wilderness. Succoth means booths or temporary dwellings. This is as far as they can go and have water and food, and from now on we'll only have to totally rely on God. Anytime you read about wilderness in the Bible, we need to think about this as a time when there's nothing but God. Because you can always find a scrap or two or something to help yourself. But when you're in the wilderness that God puts you in, He's leading them into the wilderness, He's teaching you to live off of Him and Him alone. So we need to think that principle. When you see the wilderness, you're going through a trial where you have to depend on God. You can't make it on your own.
Even so in the New Testament.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
The New Testament and the Old Testament are consistent all the way through. These are principles of the character of God all the way through. He's trying to teach Israel, I'm going to take you out there where there's nothing, and then I'm going to show you who I am. And that's why when they didn't like being hungry, He brought some quail in. When they didn't like being thirsty, He hit the rock and got the water. Okay? Because there was nothing. Can you imagine 3 million people out with no water?
Right?
It takes rivers of water
Yeah.
to fix that. Okay, so He is teaching them to rely on Him. So when you're on the mountaintop, you don't need God. But when you're in the valley, when you're in the wilderness, you're going to have to depend on God. And a lot of times we will try to go back to where bondage was or whatever. We will not have faith in God. We will not do it. So He is trying to teach us that you must. At some point you're going to have to show faith in God, not just have faith. If you say you have faith, you need to show it. And that's where the difference comes. In the wilderness you have to, because there's nothing. There's not a drop of water or any food or anything. He's going to provide all your needs when you're in the wilderness. Now I love the next ones. Verse 21, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light to go day and night. He took not away the pillar of the cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people. So, how would you like to get up in the morning and go open your front door and say, there's God. He's been watching me all night. He's right there. Okay? All of this before. We read all the way through Genesis and everything. You can't see God.
Right.
We don't know Pharaoh. He said, well, I think it's Moses and Aaron doing all this. All of the floods and all of the locusts and the lightning and all of this stuff. He didn't know where it was coming from. He thought it might be God. But now, just in a couple of verses, just matter of factly, yeah, there's God. He's right here in front of us. You can reach out and touch Him if you want to. You know, He's right there. So, how much faith would that give you to have God right in front of you everywhere you went? That there's God. He's, this cloud is going and boiling and everything.
I would think it would, but we'll read later where it didn't.
Exactly. That's well, I'm going to say that in a minute. That even with God there with them, they wanted to run. Here's 2 verses that just come out as a matter of fact that have never been seen before, and without fanfare. And God went, God went before them as a fire and cloud. This is so significant I can't put it into words. All this time Pharaoh only saw what God had done, but couldn't see anything. But Moses and Aaron. Now God is visible to everyone leading the nation of Israel. So even when the soldiers come, they're going to see this cloud and this fire. And Egypt is going to see it. They're going to say attack. I'm like, I don't know. At first they traveled by day and night to put distance between them and Pharaoh. It was also best to travel by night in the desert and rest during the day. How nice it would be to be able to get up from your bed and look outside and see God standing guard, protecting all of our people. The Hebrews saw every day that God was real and He was protecting them from all enemies. But later we'll see their countenance will fall and say that they have been brought out to the desert to die. Faith is a gift from God, and only He can give you more. Next week we'll see God rescue Israel and bring them from the impossible circumstances. Going through the Red Sea under the cloud will take on a new meaning next week.